Over 70 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, the international community adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Under this declaration, the international community collectively set out fundamental rights to be universally protected, without distinction of any kind. Since then, international human rights law and human rights protections have rapidly advanced. The international human rights system, made up of conventions, human rights bodies, and courts of law, aim to protect populations from abuses of their inalienable human rights. Despite the broad expansion of this system, populations across the globe continue to suffer human rights abuses. Violations of civil and political rights, as well as violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, often target minority and other already vulnerable populations, such as women and children, the LGBTQIA+ community, and refugees, leaving them increasingly at risk of violence, persecution, and other abuses. Societies where governments restrict the human rights of certain sectors of the population, or fail to provide adequate protections for violations and abuses of human rights perpetrated by others, may be at risk of mass atrocity crimes, namely genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. These conscious, shocking crimes do not begin with mass killings or targeted violence against particular groups, but are rather part of a process that may begin with smaller-scale abuses, restrictions on fundamental freedoms, or demonization of a group on the basis of their ethnicity, religion, language, or other defining features. The genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, for example, did not begin with ethnic-based killings, but with a concerted effort to demonize or generate fear surrounding Tutsis in the media. Human rights violations and abuses do not just serve as effective early warning signs for these crimes, but can, in and of themselves, amount to atrocities. While it's clear that we must start addressing these violations as precursors for atrocities in order to effectively prevent them, the international community has struggled to translate this early warning into early action. On the 25th of August 2017, the Myanmar military, also known as the Tatmadaw, initiated so-called clearance operations against the Muslim minority Rohingya population, brutally killing thousands of people and forcing 745,000, the majority of the Rohingya population, to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. A UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar found that these attacks amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes in Rakhine State, as well as genocide against the Rohingya.
The Rohingya have lived in Myanmar for centuries, but they're not officially recognized as one of the country's 135 ethnic groups. The government denies them citizenship and claims they're illegal immigrants that have crossed over from Bangladesh, making them essentially a stateless people.
Assalamu alaikum. Ara Rohingya zati. Ara hokkan. Ara dunyatun sai.
The Myanmar government has further restricted the Rohingyas' participation in society through so-called protection of race and religion laws, which were passed in 2015 and place harsh restrictions on women and non-Buddhists. This includes restrictions on fundamental religious freedoms as well as reproductive and marital rights. Rohingyas and other Muslim populations in Myanmar have also been the target of hate speech and victims of intercommunal violence, often incited by ultra-nationalist Buddhist groups.
What kinds of crimes are the Burmese military committing against the Rohingya people?
We have evidence, we have proof that Myanmar government is committing genocide against Rohingya. The Myanmar government and ultra-nationalist Buddhist hate Rohingya people due to nationalism-fueled racism and Islamophobia.
While some Buddhist monks, like the infamous Ashin Werathu, are notorious for perpetuating hate speech against the Rohingya, it's the military that encourages those sentiments, in some cases denying Rohingya even exist.
For example, clashes between Rakhine Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims in 2012 left nearly 200 people dead and 140,000 displaced. The government's refusal to end discriminatory state policies regarding the Rohingya has encouraged violations of their fundamental human rights, and reinforce the dangerous perception of them as ethnic outsiders. This blatant discrimination provides kindling for recurrent cycles of violence against the Rohingya. The 2017 genocide itself was preceded by a months-long counterinsurgency campaign in northern Rakhine State, where Rohingyas were victims of mass arrests, torture, enforced disappearance, rape and other sexual violence, and extrajudicial killings, as well as widespread destruction of Rohingya mosques and homes. The situation faced by the Rohingya in Myanmar is a clear example of how targeted government policies and human rights abuses against a minority group provide a clear pathway for mass atrocities. Since 2015, populations in the East African country of Burundi have endured a protracted political and human rights crisis.
Burundi is a tiny country in the Great Lakes region of Africa. It shot into the headlines when President Pierre Nkurunziza decided to run for a third term in office. People took to the streets, claiming he was violating the constitution. Peaceful protests soon turned violent. Hundreds were killed.
Mass protests of Nkurunziza's announcement led to a crackdown on opposition parties, oppression, mass arbitrary detentions, killings, and torture at the hands of Burundi's ruling party, the CNDD-FDD. The government utilized its youth wing, known as the Imbonerakure, to persecute alleged government opponents and civil society activists.
All my family had already fled. They live near here now. My problems really began last night, but we were threatened for a long time. They said that those who had family who had already left the country had no reason to stay in Burundi. They told us to leave.
The men who threatened them are the Imbonerakure. It's a Kirundi word which means those who see far. The Imbonerakure form the youth league of the ruling party, which is dominated by former Hutu rebels. The UN says the Imbonerakure are a dangerous militia.
zirababwira ati nimuvemwo au niputinya kwanyu batubwira tuveko ati mutavuyeho turabamara ati bababwira kugwandiko au bababwira umuntu au gasanga amabaruwa basize kunzu yaho ku muryango ngaho yani ku muryango mwijoro ukabyuka ugiye ukugayisanga nkaho bacusoma ati wowe utavuyeho tayari turakwica muvaho nyene vaho nitubakene canke bakazana nk'amahera tutaya canze.
I hid to avoid the Imbonerakures checkpoints and managed to slip through. All night they patrol. If you're unlucky enough to meet the Imbonerakure, they will kill you.
Videos emerged of Imbonerakure threatening rape and other abuses against their adversaries. A UN Human Rights Council mandated Commission of Inquiry found that ongoing abuses may amount to crimes against humanity, including extrajudicial killings, summary executions, disappearances, sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and torture. Since gaining independence, Burundi has a long history of atrocity crimes. High-level government officials have deliberately misused historical context to gain and remain in power, and many of those in power today are implicated in the abuses perpetrated since 2015.
Whoever commits a crime says he's an Imbonerakure or a member of the ruling party. Those who are living abroad will tell you they were arrested at night by the Imbonerakure. That's absolutely untrue. I'm a former Imbonerakure. The current president is a former Imbonerakure. All the hopes of the Burundian people are pinned on the Imbonerakure Youth League. Thanks to its strength, its bravery, and its patriotism.
The Burundian government, now headed by President Evariste Ndayishimiye, has yet to meaningfully engage in reconciliation for its abuses against civilian populations.
For without justice, there can be no peace. A country without justice cannot live in peace.
Since 2014, Venezuelans have carried out widespread protests due to inflation, lack of basic goods and services, and corruption. Security and intelligence forces have responded through a countrywide campaign to silence dissent and combat crime. Throughout this campaign, they've committed systematic human rights violations and abuses, including arbitrary detentions, short-term enforced disappearances, torture, ill treatment, and sexual and gender-based violence, in a context of pervasive impunity. State agents have also carried out tens of thousands of alleged extrajudicial executions. According to Lupa por la Vida, a local civil society organization, over 1,400 extrajudicial killings were carried out in 2021 alone.
Araceli Sanchez keeps track of the killings. Despite the death threats, she says she won't give up.
We have to denounce it. We have to document it. We know we are not in a time of justice, but it has to be done, because if we stay quiet, we allow the same thing that happened to us to happen to others.
She wants justice for her son, Dal Wilson, a promising student shot in the back by suspected state actors in 2013, and for the thousands of men killed in extrajudicial violence in Venezuela.
It's a massacre, an extermination of young Venezuelans.
Human rights groups say the crackdown on Venezuela's young men is getting worse, with frequent raids into the barrios surrounding Caracas. Nicolas Maduro's government says it's to curb crime, but the barrios are turning on his regime.
I think that this is terrorism that they inflict on the people of the barrios, so that the people do not come out and protest.
It was horrible. They had no compassion for our little girl. Nothing. They just took him as they struck him. They put him on the van, and they hit him, and they hit him, and they hit him.
Yaledi says her engineering husband Ronnie was grabbed in March from their home by men in black uniforms. She searched for him for weeks. She doesn't know why they took him, doesn't know what to tell her 3 children. The state hasn't commented on Ronnie's case. He was found next to a pile of trash, both hands missing and badly burnt.
Just as my children ended up without a father, there are a lot of kids who could as well, if we continue this way.
In addition to persecuting and jailing political opponents, the government has also harassed, criminalized, and persecuted civil society, independent media, and human rights activists reporting on ongoing violations. A UN Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding mission on Venezuela warned that patterns of violence and abuses since 2014 were authorized at the highest level of government and committed as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population that may amount to crimes against humanity. Long before law enforcement officials brutally cracked down on the 2014 protests, Venezuelan authorities gradually eroded civic and democratic space, amidst endemic corruption and a lack of judicial independence. These measures have consolidated a culture of impunity and shielded those in power, paving a way for a carte blanche for state agents. Systematic human rights violations and abuses continue in Venezuela with no prospects for justice or accountability. The effective prevention of atrocity crimes has the potential to avoid significant loss of life, as well as physical and psychological damage and trauma. Ensuring all human rights abuses are viewed through an atrocity prevention lens can help to better identify patterns of abuse that may devolve into mass atrocity crimes.